Amir arrived at the apartment complex with a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had been searching for a new place to live for weeks, and this opportunity seemed promising. The building was well maintained, with a freshly painted exterior and neatly trimmed hedges lining the walkway. Amir straightened his tie and checked his reflection in his phone's camera before approaching the office. Inside, Gerald sat behind a large desk, his eyes narrowing as Amir entered. "Good morning," Amir said, extending his hand. "I'm here about the apartment for rent." Gerald hesitated before shaking Amir's hand, his grip noticeably weak. "Name?" he asked curtly. "Amir Kazemi," Amir replied, maintaining his polite demeanor. Gerald's expression soured. "Kazemi? That's not a local name, is it?" Amir explained that his parents had immigrated years ago, but he was born and raised in the city. As they discussed the apartment, Gerald's tone grew increasingly dismissive. He made vague comments about cultural fit and community standards. Despite Amir's qualifications and readiness to sign a lease, Gerald abruptly ended the meeting, claiming the apartment was no longer available. Amir left the office, his earlier excitement replaced by a heavy sense of disappointment and anger. He knew what had happened. He had faced such discrimination before, but it never got easier. As he walked away, a strange breeze rustled through the trees, though the air was still. Unbeknownst to both men, an ancient spirit of justice had stirred, sensing the injustice that had just occurred. This invisible force, a manifestation of karmic balance, began to coalesce around the apartment complex. It had no physical form but existed as a palpable energy, drawn to places where fairness and equality were under threat. The spirit observed Gerald through the office window, noting the smug satisfaction on his face as he shredded Amir's application. The air in the office grew heavy, causing Gerald to shiver involuntarily. The stage was set for a confrontation between entrenched prejudice and the unyielding force of justice. Amir arrived home, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Layla, his sister, immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Amir recounted his experience with Gerald, his voice growing tighter as he described the thinly veiled racism he'd encountered. Layla's expression shifted from concern to indignation. "This is unacceptable," she declared, pacing the small living room. "We can't let him get away with this." Amir sighed, having been through similar situations before. "What can we do? It's his property." Layla's eyes sparked with determination. "We organize. We protest. We make noise." She grabbed her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she messaged local activist groups. Within hours, Layla had set up a meeting with other community organizers at a nearby coffee shop. The next evening, Layla sat surrounded by a diverse group of passionate individuals. "We need to show Gerald and others like him that discrimination won't be tolerated," she explained, outlining her plan for a peaceful demonstration outside the apartment complex. The group discussed logistics, made signs, and strategized about involving local media. As the meeting wrapped up, Amir arrived to walk Layla home. He pulled her aside, worry evident in his voice. "Are you sure about this? What if things get out of hand?" Layla squeezed his hand reassuringly. "This is how change happens, Amir. We have to stand up for what's right." On their way home, Amir couldn't shake his concerns. He'd seen peaceful protests turn ugly before, and the thought of Layla in danger terrified him. But as he watched his sister's animated gestures and heard the passion in her voice as she detailed her plans, he realized there was no stopping her. Layla had always been the fighter in the family, and her determination was a force to be reckoned with. The day of the protest arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension in the air. A crowd had gathered outside the apartment complex, their voices rising in unison as they chanted for equality and justice. Colorful signs bobbed above the sea of people, demanding an end to housing discrimination. Local news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing the scene. Amir stood at the edge of the crowd, a mix of pride and anxiety churning in his stomach as he watched Layla take center stage. She stood on a small platform, her voice carrying over the protesters through a megaphone. "We are here today because discrimination has no place in our community," she declared, her words met with cheers and applause. From his office window, Gerald glared at the scene below. His face reddened with anger as he recognized Amir in the crowd. He grabbed his phone, furiously dialing his lawyer to discuss options for shutting down the protest. The demonstration was attracting unwanted attention to his business practices, and he was determined to put an end to it. As Layla continued her impassioned speech, the invisible spirit of justice hovered nearby, its energy intertwining with the crowd's fervor. It observed Gerald's growing anger, sensing the conflict about to unfold. The spirit's presence seemed to amplify Layla's words, giving them an almost tangible power that resonated with the protesters. Housing is a basic right. Layla's voice rang out. We demand fair treatment for all, regardless of race, religion, or national origin. The crowd erupted in agreement, their energy building. Amir, despite his initial reservations, found himself moved by his sister's words and the unity of the community around him. As the protest reached its peak, Gerald emerged from the building, flanked by security guards. His face was a mask of contempt as he approached the edge of the crowd. The spirit of justice tensed, preparing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. The air crackled with tension as Gerald raised his hand, demanding silence. As the protest continued outside, an elegantly dressed man named Samuel approached the apartment complex. He walked with purpose, his keen eyes taking in the scene. Gerald, spotting Samuel through the window, quickly composed himself and rushed to greet him at the entrance, eager to divert attention from the commotion outside. "Welcome, Mr. Johnson," Gerald said, forcing a smile. "I apologize for the disturbance. Let me show you around our diverse and inclusive community." He emphasized the last words, speaking loudly enough for nearby protesters to hear. Samuel nodded politely, allowing Gerald to lead him through the building. As they walked, Gerald pointed out various amenities, constantly steering the conversation away from the protest. "As you can see, we have residents from all walks of life here," Gerald lied smoothly, gesturing to a conveniently diverse group of people in the lobby. The tour culminated on a spacious balcony overlooking the courtyard. Gerald, growing more confident, began to boast about his fair housing practices. However, as he stepped forward to make a grand gesture, the spirit of justice intervened. A sudden gust of wind swept across the balcony, causing Gerald to lose his balance. As Gerald stumbled, he instinctively reached out to steady himself, knocking over a potted plant. The pot shattered, revealing a hidden compartment containing a stack of documents. Papers scattered across the balcony, carried by the wind. Samuel, quick to react, bent down to gather the fallen documents. As he straightened the papers, his eyes widened at their contents. Rental applications were marked with racial slurs and discriminatory notes. Financial records showed inflated rents for minority tenants. Gerald, realizing what Samuel had seen, began to stammer excuses. But Samuel's demeanor had changed entirely. He pulled out a badge, his voice stern as he spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not a potential investor. I'm Samuel Johnson, Federal Housing Inspector. We've received numerous complaints about your practices, and now I see they were well-founded." The color drained from Gerald's face as he realized the gravity of the situation. The spirit of justice, unseen but ever-present, seemed to intensify the moment, as if ensuring that every word and reaction was etched into the fabric of reality. Gerald's mind raced as he tried to formulate an explanation. "There must be some misunderstanding," he sputtered, reaching for the documents in Samuel's hands. But Samuel held firm, his eyes scanning the incriminating evidence. "Mr. Thompson, these documents speak for themselves," Samuel said, his tone measured but firm. "We've been investigating your properties for months following a series of anonymous tips." He didn't mention that many of these tips had come from Layla, who had been meticulously gathering evidence and testimonies from affected residents. As the reality of his situation sank in, Gerald's demeanor shifted from defensive to desperate. "Look, I can explain everything. Times are tough, and sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to keep a business afloat." His excuses fell flat as Samuel continued to examine the documents. Meanwhile, the commotion in the balcony had caught the attention of residents in nearby apartments. Curious faces appeared in windows, and a small crowd began to gather in the courtyard below. Word spread quickly that something significant was happening. Samuel, aware of the growing audience, spoke clearly and authoritatively. "Mr. Thompson, based on what I've seen here, I'm initiating an immediate and comprehensive audit of all your properties." He pulled out his phone and began making calls to his team. As federal housing officials arrived on the scene, joining the protest outside, the atmosphere in the complex shifted dramatically. Residents, emboldened by the presence of authorities, began to come forward with their own stories of mistreatment and discrimination. One elderly tenant approached Samuel, her voice trembling as she recounted years of neglect and unfair rent increases. Others joined in, painting a picture of systemic exploitation that went far beyond what the initial complaints had suggested. Gerald, now visibly shaken, retreated to his office, locking the door behind him. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and the long-hidden truth of his practices was finally coming to light. The spirit of justice, though unseen, seemed to permeate the air, as if ensuring that every voice was heard and every injustice recorded. In the days following Samuel's revelation, the apartment complex buzzed with activity. Residents, previously isolated by fear and mistrust, began to come together. Amir and Layla found themselves at the center of a growing community movement. They organized meetings in the complex's common area, where people shared their experiences and discussed ways to fight back against Gerald's discriminatory practices. Amir, initially hesitant, found his voice as he listened to others' stories that mirrored his own. "We need to document everything," Layla urged during one packed meeting. "Every unfair rent increase, every ignored maintenance request, every instance of discrimination. We're building a case not just against Gerald, but against the system that allowed this to happen." As the community united, Gerald's attempts to regain control grew increasingly desperate. He sent out notices threatening eviction for those participating in the meetings, but his threats rang hollow in the face of the ongoing federal investigation. One evening, Gerald appeared at a community meeting, attempting to smooth things over. "I'm here to listen and make things right," he claimed, his smile strained. But the residents weren't buying it. One by one, they stood up and confronted him with their grievances. Amir watched as the man who had dismissed him so callously now squirmed under the collective gaze of the community. It was a powerful moment of reckoning. The media, drawn by the initial protest, now camped outside the complex, eager for updates. Layla, recognizing the opportunity, organized press conferences where residents could share their stories. The local news ran nightly segments on the unfolding drama. As public interest grew, so did the pressure on local officials to address the broader issues of housing discrimination in the city. What had started as one man's fight for an apartment had ballooned into a citywide conversation about equality and justice. Through it all, the spirit of justice seemed to hover over the complex, its unseen presence felt in the newfound courage of the residents and the unraveling of Gerald's carefully constructed facade of respectability. The consequences of Gerald's actions began to ripple outward, affecting not just the residents of his apartment complex, but the entire community. As more stories came to light, other landlords in the area found themselves under scrutiny, with tenants emboldened to speak out against unfair practices. A group of residents, led by Amir and Layla, formed a tenants' rights organization. They held workshops on housing laws, helped people document their experiences, and provided support for those navigating the legal system. The movement grew beyond the confines of the apartment complex, attracting supporters from across the city. Meanwhile, Samuel's investigation progressed rapidly. His team uncovered a trail of falsified documents, discriminatory lending practices, and a network of collaborators who had helped Gerald maintain his facade for years. The evidence was damning, pointing to systemic issues that went far beyond one man's prejudices. Gerald, seeing the walls closing in, made increasingly frantic attempts to salvage his reputation. He hired a PR firm to spin the story, portraying himself as a misunderstood businessman caught in changing times. But his efforts fell flat in the face of mounting evidence and witness testimonies. One morning, residents awoke to find notices plastered around the complex, announcing a tenant appreciation day with promises of rent reductions and improved services. Most saw through the transparent ploy, tearing down the notices and replacing them with flyers for the next community meeting. As the legal process gained momentum, some of Gerald's former employees came forward, offering insider information about his operations. Their testimonies provided crucial details that strengthened the case against him. The spirit of justice, ever present, seemed to guide these revelations, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. Its influence was felt in the courage of whistleblowers, the diligence of investigators, and the unwavering determination of the community to see justice done. In a significant turning point, the City Council called a special session to address the housing crisis brought to light by the case. Amir and Layla were invited to speak, sharing their experiences and presenting a list of demands for fair housing practices. The community's efforts culminated in a large assembly held in the local high school auditorium. People from all walks of life packed the room, united in their pursuit of justice and equality. The air buzzed with anticipation as Amir and Layla took the stage. Amir, once hesitant to speak out, now addressed the crowd with confidence. "We gathered here today not just as victims of discrimination, but as agents of change," he began. He recounted his experience with Gerald, his voice steady as he described the humiliation and anger he'd felt. Layla followed, her passionate words electrifying the audience. "This isn't just about one landlord or one apartment complex," she declared. "It's about dismantling a system that has allowed discrimination to thrive in the shadows for far too long." As they spoke, the invisible spirit of justice seemed to pulse through the room, its energy palpable in the collective resolve of the assembled crowd. People nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears as they recognized their own struggles in the siblings' words. After the speeches, community members lined up to share their own stories. An elderly woman described decades of subtle discrimination. A young family recounted their struggle to find housing due to their last name. Each testimony added weight to the collective call for change. The assembly reached its emotional peak when Samuel took the stage. He presented a comprehensive overview of the investigation's findings, laying bare the extent of Gerald's discriminatory practices. The room fell silent as he detailed the systemic nature of the problem, extending far beyond one man's actions. As the assembly drew to a close, there was a sense of unity and purpose that hadn't existed before. People exchanged contact information, made plans for future actions, and signed petitions demanding stricter enforcement of fair housing laws. Amir and Layla, surrounded by supporters, felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had started this journey alone, but now found themselves at the heart of a movement. The spirit of justice, though unseen, seemed to wrap around them, a silent acknowledgement of their role in bringing light to long-hidden injustices. The momentum built by the community assembly led to a pivotal public hearing at City Hall. Gerald, compelled by legal summons, found himself face-to-face with those he had wronged. The room was packed, with overflow crowds watching on screens outside. One by one, residents stepped forward to testify. An elderly man described how Gerald had ignored critical repairs, endangering his health. A single mother recounted how she'd been threatened with eviction after complaining about racial slurs from maintenance staff. Each story added to the weight of evidence against Gerald. Gerald sat stone-faced, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. When it was his turn to speak, he attempted to paint himself as a victim of changing times and misunderstandings. But his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming testimony against him. Samuel presented the findings of his investigation, his voice steady as he detailed years of systematic discrimination. He showed charts of rent disparities based on tenants' ethnicities, emails where Gerald instructed staff to discourage certain applicants, and financial records revealing a pattern of exploitation. As the hearing progressed, Gerald's facade began to crumble. Under intense questioning from city officials, he contradicted himself several times. His carefully crafted image of a misunderstood businessman gave way to reveal a man cornered by his own actions. Amir and Layla, seated in the front row, watched as the man who had caused them so much pain was finally held accountable. The spirit of justice, though invisible, seemed to fill the room, its presence felt in the unwavering resolve of the witnesses and the growing discomfort of Gerald. Towards the end of the hearing, the city council announced immediate actions: a full audit of all Gerald's properties, suspension of his business licenses pending investigation, and the establishment of a task force to address housing discrimination citywide. As the hearing concluded, there was a sense that this was more than a victory against one man. It was a turning point for the entire community, a moment when long-ignored voices were finally heard and long-standing injustices were brought to light. The culmination of months of struggle, investigation, and community action came to a head in a packed courtroom. The air was thick with tension as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict in the case against Gerald. Amir and Layla sat in the front row, surrounded by fellow activists and community members who had become like family through their shared fight. Gerald sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor now replaced by a look of resigned defeat. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, cleared her throat and began to speak. In the case of the state versus Gerald Thompson, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts of housing discrimination, fraud, and exploitation. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by muffled cheers. The judge continued, outlining the penalties. Gerald was to forfeit ownership of all his properties, pay substantial fines, and serve time in prison. His real estate license was permanently revoked. As the full weight of the verdict sank in, Amir felt a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a strange sense of emptiness. The fight that had consumed so much of his life was over. He turned to Layla, whose eyes shone with unshed tears. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. As Amir and Layla emerged, they were met with applause and cheers. Reporters thrust microphones towards them, asking for statements. Layla, ever the spokesperson, spoke about the victory being not just for them, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. In the days that followed, the impact of the verdict reverberated through the city. The apartment complex where it all began was to be turned over to a non-profit organization dedicated to providing fair, affordable housing. Amir, in a poetic turn of events, was offered an apartment there, the very one he had originally been denied. As Amir packed his belongings, preparing to move into his new home, he reflected on the journey. What had started as a personal setback had turned into a movement that changed the lives of many. The spirit of justice, its work done for now, seemed to linger one last time, a gentle breeze that ruffled the pages of Amir's lease agreement, a document free from any hint of discrimination. Layla, helping her brother move, spoke of future plans. The fight for equality wasn't over, she insisted. There were other battles to be fought, other injustices to be addressed. But for now, they allowed themselves to savor this victory, knowing that their actions had made their community a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. As the sun set on moving day, Amir stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city. The future, once clouded by the shadow of discrimination, now seemed bright with possibility. He smiled, feeling for the first time in a long while truly at home.